The first thing is that for suppliers, interest in the indicator varies by sector, and so we believe it's very important for suppliers to understand the sustainability maturity of the target markets that they're focused on. So if you've got a technology that enables sustainability, for example, as opposed to narrowly on carbon, then central government's an area that might be a good market for you. Other sectors where maybe the innovation's value is purely around carbon management, energy efficiency, maybe it's in the private sector that may be more opportunity. Marketing messages need to be customised to the needs of those sectors, and those marketing messages will be dependent on what the supplier's innovation is and what it does. Because of that diversity of requirement, we think there's a big opportunity for the formation of new supply chains, because these organisations have very different requirements and different levels of education around these indicators. So therefore, in order to provide a compelling answer to their problems and to help them make the journey towards a more sustainable business model, there may need to be collaboration between partners and in the development of these new supply chains. The third indication we think is also quite significant. We think that suppliers will need to pay, as we go forward, much more interest in their own environmental credentials. It may be that as procurement departments become more focused on the sustainability credentials of their suppliers, because their suppliers form part of their overall value chain and their capability to have an impact on their environment, and therefore by implication the achievement of their sustainability goals, there's going to be more focus from procurement functions and as a policy area. So suppliers need to pay more attention to that if they're going to be successful, particularly in markets that are already well aware of it, such as the public sector. So we think those are some of the implications for suppliers. So this shows, and that we believe this is the first time there's been any public segmentation of the participation in the CRC. And this is just a purely numeric segmentation. So this is showing in terms of, we went through all 2,770 organisations in the CRC and placed them into a market category that most clearly represented what we perceived was their primary business. It's quite easy to do with something like an NHS trust, kind of a clue in the title. If there's some areas where there's multiple businesses, we made a decision and had to put them into one particular category. This is a numerical breakdown. It has no relevance to the amount of energy or resources any of these sectors are consuming, but nonetheless it's useful information potentially to suppliers in terms of understanding what the breakdown might be if you have an innovative technology to take to these sectors and a particular track record in them. And of course each of these sectors have different uses of energy, different problems and challenges, and often the innovators have solutions that are relevant to those challenges. This is the segmentation for the private sector, much more diverse. The big green cheese there is manufacturing. Manufacturing represents 36% of the private sector, but 25% of the entire population of CRC participants. Just want to make the point again that there's no, that's on a numerical basis. You can see that the water sector there is only 1%. Now, that's purely in terms of the number of organisations affected by CRC. If you looked at it from an energy consumption perspective, which we don't have the data for, water would be one of the biggest users of energy amongst CRC participants, simply by virtue of the nature of their business. In terms of the, it's a relatively energy-intensive industry. So these are the segments that we broke down. We applied the indicators to in order to reveal some interesting trends in the general level of understanding across the population of the public and the private sector, and then looking down within each individual subsector of the market. If we then look down at a much lower level of granularity and look at leaders versus laggards in each of these sectors. So first, the public sector. These are the results for the 5 segments we identified in terms of leaders. As you can see, quite strong performance across all of them, 1 or 2 notable exceptions, the NHS. Police doing probably less well compared to local government, central government and academia. When we then look at the numbers of the percentage of the population in those sectors in the laggard category, this is the data. You can say they're all pretty similar, local government performing quite well with a relatively small number of laggards, and again the NHS that has, based on our analysis, a higher percentage of laggards. We're now going to show you how the picture looks across the private sector, and for the sake of time we're going to just show you the data for 3. So this is the total population of sectors in terms of leaders. We put on here financial services, the ICT sector, because we're naturally at Intellect and we feel there'll be some discussion around that, and obviously media and publishing, because we thought the audience here today would be kind of interested to see what the results were in your sector. This shows the kind of level of leadership across the whole of the private sector, and if you'll notice, considerably less than the public sector. And we bring in the laggard data, and you can see it's quite striking differences. So a sector like ICT scores probably in the mid-range in terms of leaders, but actually doing rather well in terms of the percentage of laggards. Media and publishing not doing too badly. I don't know whether that resonates with your perceptions, but that was what we discovered as far as the methodology is concerned. So that gives you one view of overall attitudes towards sustainability across the different sectors. We think that's got some important implications for suppliers that we'll talk about in just a moment. We then want to compare this with financial services. Again, by and large, pretty broad response in terms of sustainability, carbon and social awareness. But again, the more sophisticated indicator to our assessment is the environmental return on investment, not ubiquitously seen as being an important indicator across financial services. Now we have these curves for all the market sectors, and we think that it's starting to show some interesting trends, and it helps innovators who are trying to target particular sectors to take the right marketing messages around the capability of their technologies so they can choose the best sectors. So let's just summarise what we've said before we go on to talk about the implications. First thing is, this is the first segmentation of the CRC. Private sector is 3 times as large as the public sector. There is a significant difference, according to the Cambium score, between the public and the private sector. 15% of the private sector don't mention any of the indicators at all. That compares with 2% in the public sector. We've highlighted in the public sector that there are good Cambium index scores right across the board, particularly on the strongest indicator being sustainability, and the leaders as far as that indicator is concerned in central government and academia. The lowest percentage on that indicator being in NHS and police. But when it comes to carbon management, somewhat different, and interestingly, the NHS and police were also quite good performers in terms of the carbon indicator, indicating their response was much more in line with that of the private sector. So the private sector, we've already explained, manufacturing is a big part of the population. It has fewer leaders and more laggards. When we looked at who the leaders were in terms of the Cambium index scores, the biggest leaders were in the energy sector and the professional services sector. It's probably no surprise to us in that regard, because the energy sector is the very stuff of what their business is built upon, and we all know that from CRC's perspective at any rate, there's been quite a big consulting business built up around helping the participants understand what the obligations were under the legislation. In terms of the debate around sustainability, the lowest was seen in manufacturing and food and drink production. So those were the summary of the findings. So in coming to a conclusion now, what do we deduce from all of this? What are the implications? So we think there are implications for 4 key audiences: for suppliers, participants and trade bodies, for policymakers and investors. And I'll just touch on what we think the high-level implications are for all of them.